Have you ever wondered what secrets the Appalachian Mountains are hiding in the shadows? From abandoned cabins to dark caves and hidden villages, the mountains hold stories that send chills through the quiet wilderness. If you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. My ex-boyfriend, Mark, was the reason we were up there. He was obsessed with what he called unexplained Americana. He'd spend hours on the internet, digging through old newspaper archives and obscure forums, looking for stories about ghost lights, lost communities, and creatures that were supposed to live in the deep woods. His idea of a perfect date was driving for 3 hours to stand in a field where someone in 1972 claimed they saw a UFO. I usually went along with it because I loved him, and honestly, I liked the excuse to get outdoors. This particular trip was supposed to be the crown jewel of his hobby. He'd found the location of a decommissioned fire lookout tower, deep in the mountains, that was rumored to be a hotspot for strange lights that would dance over the valleys at night. The plan was to hike up, spend the night in the cab at the top of the tower, and see if the stories were true. I wasn't expecting to see anything, but the idea of watching the sunset and sunrise from that high up was appealing enough for me to agree. The hike was harder than he'd described, a steep, overgrown trail that was barely a trail at all in some places. But the tower itself was incredible. It was this skeletal steel structure, maybe 60 or 70 feet tall, with a small square room at the very top. It was rusty and the wooden steps creaked ominously with every footstep, but it felt solid enough. The cab at the top was basically just a tiny room with windows on all 4 sides, offering a breathtaking 360-degree view of the surrounding mountains, which rolled away in every direction like waves on a green ocean. We got there in the late afternoon, swept out the dusty floor, and set up our sleeping bags. Mark was practically buzzing with excitement, pointing out different peaks and telling me the stories associated with them. "They say people get lost around here all the time," he said, his face pressed against the glass. "Not just for a day or two. They walk off a trail and just vanish. Or they show up weeks later, miles from where they started, with no memory of what happened." I just nodded and smiled, more interested in the way the setting sun was turning the whole sky orange and purple. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, the world below us sank into a deep, velvety darkness. The stars started to pop out, brighter than I'd ever seen them without any city lights to wash them out. It was peaceful. We sat there for about an hour, just talking and watching the sky, and I was starting to think the trip was a success even without any ghost lights. Then Mark gasped and pointed. "There, look." I followed his finger and saw it. Down in the darkest part of the valley to our east, a single point of light had appeared. It was a soft, bluish-green color, and it was moving. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was a self-contained orb, and it moved in a way that defied explanation. It would hover for a moment, then dart to the left, then bob up and down, almost like a balloon caught in a breeze, except there was no wind. It was completely silent. Mark fumbled for his phone, trying to record it, but the light was too dim and far away to show up as anything more than a smudge. We watched it for maybe 15 minutes as it weaved its way through the trees below. It seemed to be getting closer, moving up the slope of the mountain towards the base of our tower, and then, as if it had moved directly underneath us, it just winked out. The moment the light vanished, the world went silent. It wasn't just quiet, it was a profound and total absence of sound. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of the wind against the tower, it all just stopped. It was like a switch had been flipped, plunging us into a sensory vacuum. The air in the cab suddenly felt thick and still. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice sounded flat and dead, like it wasn't traveling properly. Mark didn't answer. He was still staring out the window into the darkness where the light had been, his expression completely blank. A prickle of real fear went down my spine. This wasn't fun and spooky anymore. This felt wrong. That's when I heard the music. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. It sounded like a fiddle, a sad, high, reedy tune that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't coming from the valley. It felt like it was right outside the windows, in the dead air all around us. "Mark, do you hear that music?" I asked, my voice trembling a little. He nodded slowly, still not looking at me. "It's pretty," he mumbled, his voice distant. The music grew slowly, becoming clearer. It was a folk tune of some kind, but it was repetitive and discordant, with notes that seemed to bend and slide in unnatural ways. It made my teeth ache. Underneath the fiddle, I could hear other sounds now. The rhythmic stomping of feet, like people dancing on hard-packed earth, and faint, breathy laughter. It sounded like a party, a ghostly celebration happening on the ground right below us in the pitch-black wilderness. The feeling of wrongness intensified, becoming a heavy dread that settled in my stomach. I wanted to be anywhere else. I wanted to run down those rickety stairs and sprint through the woods, but I was paralyzed. The thought of stepping out into that silent, music-filled darkness was more terrifying than staying in the tiny glass box. I looked at Mark. He was swaying slightly, his head cocked to one side as if he was concentrating on the tune. A slow, serene smile was spreading across his face. "Mark?" I said, louder this time. I grabbed his arm. It was cold. "Mark, what is it? What's wrong with you?" He turned his head and looked at me, but it was like he was looking right through me. His eyes were wide and unfocused. "We should go down," he said, his voice a dreamy whisper. "They're waiting." Panic seized me. He reached for the handle of the cab door, the one that opened onto the small platform at the top of the stairs. I threw myself in front of him, blocking his path. "No, Mark, snap out of it. There's nothing down there." He pushed against me, not violently, but with a placid, unthinking strength, like a sleepwalker. "I want to see the lights," he said, his eyes still fixed on something far away. "They're dancing." The music was swirling around the tower now, louder and more chaotic. The laughter sounded closer, thin and reedy. I could almost feel the vibration of the stomping feet through the steel frame of the tower. I was crying now, pleading with him, shaking his shoulders. "Please, Mark, listen to me. It's not real. Please, come back." It was like trying to wake someone from the deepest sleep. He was in a trance, completely captivated by the phantom sounds. For a horrifying 10 minutes, we struggled in that tiny, claustrophobic space. Me, trying to hold the door shut and keep him inside, and him, gently but relentlessly trying to go outside and join the ghostly festival below. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, being trapped 60 feet in the air with the person I loved, who had become a complete stranger, lost to a siren song I could barely stand to hear. Then, just as abruptly as it started, it was over. The music, the dancing, the laughter, it all just stopped. The silence that followed was just as sudden, but this time it was different. A second later, the normal sounds of the forest flooded back in. The crickets started their chorus again. A breeze sighed against the windows. It was like the world had been holding its breath and had finally let it out. Mark blinked, his whole body shuddering. He looked down at his hand on the door handle, then at me, huddled against it. Confusion washed over his face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I feel weird. I was watching the light, and then I just feel so tired." He had no memory of the music, of our struggle, of him trying to leave the tower. He remembered the blue light, and then nothing until that moment. He thought he had just zoned out or fallen asleep on his feet for a few minutes. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me as I said them. He looked at me like I was crazy. Then a flicker of fear entered his own eyes as he saw the genuine terror on my face. We didn't talk much after that. We sat on opposite sides of the cab, wrapped in our sleeping bags but not sleeping, waiting for the sun to come up. The rest of the night was still and uneventful, but the fear never left me. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, we packed our things in a frantic silence and practically ran down the stairs. I didn't look at anything but my feet until we were on the solid ground. As we started down the trail, I risked one last glance back at the tower, and that's when I saw it. At the base of one of the steel legs, there was a small, perfectly constructed ring of smooth gray river stones. Inside the ring was a single, freshly picked wildflower, a white trillium, its petals still dewy. It hadn't been there the day before. I know it hadn't. I didn't say anything to Mark. I just grabbed his hand and pulled him down the path, and we didn't stop walking until we were back at the car. I only went because Jenna asked me to. She and Caleb had been dating for about a year, and he was one of those guys who was intensely into his hobbies, and his current obsession was caving. Not the tourist kind, where you walk on a paved path with colored lights pointing out formations that look like bacon. He was into wild caving, squeezing through muddy holes in the middle of nowhere to explore places most people never see. He made it sound thrilling, like being an astronaut on another planet. Jenna was scared of it, but she was so in love with him that she'd have followed him into a volcano. He'd been pestering me for weeks to come with them on a serious trip. I kept making excuses, but then Jenna called me and said, "Please come. I don't want to go by myself with him. It would make me feel so much better if you were there." That's a hard thing to say no to when it's your best friend, so I said yes. That was my first mistake. The cave was a 4-mile hike from the nearest dirt road. Its entrance was just a dark slit in a rock face at the bottom of a ravine, half hidden by ferns. Caleb was in his element, grinning as he checked our gear. We each had a helmet with a primary headlamp and a backup, a small pack with water and protein bars, and a pair of sturdy gloves. He was the only one with a rope, a long coil slung over his shoulder. "All right, ladies," he said, his voice echoing slightly as he ducked into the entrance. "Time for the grand tour. Stick close, do what I say, and you'll be fine." The first hour was mostly just uncomfortable. The passages were narrow and we had to crawl on our hands and knees through cold, sticky mud. The air was thick and smelled of wet stone and decay. My headlamp cut a bright white circle in a world of absolute, profound blackness. The only sounds were our own breathing, the scuff of our boots, and Caleb's cheerful instructions from up ahead. I was starting to feel the claustrophobia tighten in my chest, the irrational fear that the rock above me was getting heavier with every inch we moved forward. The real trouble started when we reached what Caleb called the birthing canal. It was a horizontal crack in the rock that was maybe 1.5 feet high and went on for about 30 feet. To get through, you had to lie on your stomach and pull yourself forward with your elbows, like a soldier under barbed wire. Jenna went first, then me. It was horrible. I could feel the weight of the entire mountain pressing down on me. My helmet scraped the ceiling, and my pack kept snagging on the rough floor. Halfway through, I had a moment of pure panic where I was convinced I was stuck. I could hear Jenna's panicked breathing ahead of me and Caleb's voice behind me, pushing me on. "You're almost there. Don't stop now. You'll jam up the whole works." I finally wriggled out the other side, shaking and covered in mud, into a much larger chamber. Caleb came through last, a triumphant grin on his face. It was then, as I was catching my breath, that I realized we couldn't go back the way we came. The canal was angled slightly downwards. Going through it head first was one thing. Trying to go back feet first would be nearly impossible. I felt a spike of fear. Our only way out was forward. We continued for what felt like hours, descending deeper into the earth. The cave changed, opening into vast galleries with dripping stalactites, then pinching down into tight, winding canyons. We had to climb over huge piles of fallen rock and wade through waist-deep pools of frigid water. My initial anxiety had settled into a dull, exhausted dread. All I wanted was to see the sky again. We finally came to a ledge overlooking a deep, black pit. It was at least a 40-foot drop. "This is it," Caleb said, his eyes gleaming in the beam of his headlamp. "This is the last big obstacle. The old-timers' maps say there's another way out through the lower passages." He uncoiled his rope and found a sturdy-looking rock formation to tie it to. "It's an easy rappel. I'll go first, then Jenna, then you. I'll be at the bottom to help you both." I looked at Jenna. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Caleb, I don't know about this," she said, her voice a small quiver. "Maybe we should just stay here. We can't go back, but maybe someone will find us." Caleb's smile vanished. "Don't be ridiculous, Jen. This is the whole point of the trip. Are you going to back out now, after we've come all this way?" His voice was sharp, dismissive. He was looking at her, but it felt like the question was for both of us. The pressure was immense. To argue felt like admitting defeat, like being a coward. Neither of us said another word. Caleb rappelled down into the darkness with practiced ease. Jenna went next, crying silently as she lowered herself over the edge. I followed. The rope was slick with mud and my arms ached. I landed at the bottom on a pile of loose rock, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. We were all standing at the bottom of the pit, our headlamps pointed up at the single rope hanging down from the ledge 40 feet above. It was our only connection to the world we knew. Caleb untied the rope from his harness, walked back over to the wall we had just descended, and began pulling the rope down. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharp with alarm. "We need that to get back up if the other way is blocked." Caleb just laughed. He kept pulling, the rope coiling at his feet. "We're not going back up," he said, not looking at us. "There's no adventure in going back. The only way is forward." He gave one final, hard tug. The end of the rope whipped down from the ledge above and landed in a heap in the mud. He had just trapped us. He had deliberately and methodically removed our only way of escape. The change in the chamber was immediate. It was the same space, the same 3 people, but the air was suddenly suffocating. We were no longer explorers, we were prisoners. Jenna started screaming, a raw, terrified sound that echoed horribly in the enclosed space. She rushed at Caleb, beating on his chest with her fists, but he just stood there, impassive. "Stop it, Jen. You're wasting energy." He sounded like a different person. His friendly, confident mask had dropped, and underneath was something cold and hard. I just stared at him, my mind struggling to process the betrayal. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice he had made. He had led us down here with the intention of trapping us. "There's another way out, Caleb," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said there was. Show us." He finally looked at me, and his expression was one I will never forget. It was a look of ecstatic, unhinged excitement. "There is," he said, "and we're going to find it. It's been lost for 100 years. We're going to be famous." It was then I knew we were probably going to die. He wasn't just reckless, he was insane. We had no choice but to follow him. He had the rope, the most experience, and the only real sense of what to do next, even if it was based on a delusion. Our survival depended on the man who had just condemned us. The hours that followed are a blur of misery and fear. We followed him deeper and deeper, through passages that got smaller and smaller. We ran out of water. Jenna's headlamp started to flicker, a dying yellow eye in the darkness. My own was getting dim. Caleb pushed us relentlessly, ignoring Jenna's sobbing and my pleas to stop and rest. He was muttering to himself, talking about a map he'd seen, about a river that flowed to the surface. It was all nonsense. We were hopelessly, irretrievably lost. Finally, in a small, damp passage, Jenna's light went out for good. She collapsed onto the floor, refusing to go any further. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't, Caleb. Just leave me here." Caleb turned and looked at us, his face illuminated by his own bright headlamp. There was no pity in his eyes. "Fine," he said. "Stay here and rot." He turned his back on us and started walking away, his light disappearing around a bend in the tunnel. I reached out and switched off my own failing headlamp to conserve the last dregs of its battery. We were plunged into a blackness so complete it was physical. It pressed against my eyes. I could hear Jenna's ragged breathing next to me. I could hear, far down the passage, the sound of Caleb's boots splashing through a puddle, and then the sound of him humming a cheerful, tuneless song to himself, until that too faded away, and there was only the sound of our own hearts beating in the suffocating, silent dark. For 15 years, my job was to keep the signals alive. I was a senior technician for a telecommunications company, and I specialized in remote tower maintenance. When a storm knocked out a cell relay or a radio repeater on some godforsaken mountaintop, I was the guy they sent to fix it. I liked the work. It was quiet, it was methodical, and I was good at it. I understood electricity. I understood radio waves. I understood how a signal could be degraded by a failing amplifier or a loose connection. I thought I understood all the strange noises the world could make. My job was to find the logical cause of the chaos and restore order with a soldering iron and a multimeter. I was comfortable with logic. I was comfortable with solitude. I was not prepared for what happened at the tower on Ridge 4. The call came after a particularly nasty summer thunderstorm had torn through the northern ranges. One of our main microwave relay towers had gone offline. It was a critical piece of infrastructure, bouncing data across 100 miles of wilderness, so getting it back up was a top priority. The tower was on a bald peak, accessible only by a 10-mile-long gravel service road that was more of a goat path. It was a 2-day job at minimum, so I packed my truck with my tools, diagnostic gear, and enough food and water to last me a while, just in case. The drive up was rough, but the view from the top was always something else. The tower itself was a 300-foot spike of galvanized steel, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Next to it was a small, windowless concrete building that housed the power systems and climate-controlled electronics. It was my workshop and my hotel for the next 48 hours. The first day was frustrating. The storm had done a number on the primary array, but the damage wasn't straightforward. I was getting power surges that made no sense and feedback loops that shouldn't have been possible. The diagnostic software was spitting out error codes that were just gibberish, strings of characters that looked more like a software bug than an equipment failure. Late in the afternoon, I tried to radio into the regional office for a consult. The connection was awful. It was buried in a sea of static, but it was a weird kind of static. It was rhythmic, with a strange, clicking, almost chittering quality to it. "Sounds like you've got some serious atmospheric interference up there, Dave," my boss crackled over the radio. "Just do what you can. Check in tomorrow." I signed off and spent the rest of the evening tracing wires, feeling a growing sense of irritation. Nothing was behaving the way it was supposed to. It felt like the basic laws of electronics had decided to take a holiday. I went to bed late, sleeping on a cot I kept in the service hut. I was woken up around 2 in the morning by a sound. It was the same rhythmic, chittering static from the radio, but the radio was turned off. It was a faint sound, and it seemed to be coming from the tower itself, conducted down through the thick copper grounding cables that ran into the building. I lay there in the dark, listening. It sounded like a million tiny insects clicking in unison, but with a strange, metallic echo. I got up and went to the heavy steel door of the hut, pressing my ear against it. The sound was clearer outside. It was a high-frequency vibration, a hum that you felt in your teeth as much as you heard with your ears. I told myself it was just the wind vibrating one of the thousands of steel struts on the tower in a strange way. It had to be the wind. I went back to my cot and tried to ignore it. but the sound seemed to seep into my skull, a constant, irritating pulse that made sleep impossible. The next day, the strangeness continued. The lights in the hut would flicker in time with the pulsing hum from the tower. My multimeter would give me a reading of 17 volts 1 second and 95 the next from the same stable power supply. I felt like I was losing my mind. I decided to take a break and get some fresh air. I was standing outside, leaning against my truck and drinking a cup of coffee, when I saw something move. It was at the very edge of my vision, a flicker of motion against the blue sky. I looked up, but there was nothing there. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time it was more substantial. It was a shape, a huge, dark shape, that seemed to cross my field of vision in an instant. It was like a shadow had detached itself from the ground and leaped across the sky. It was too fast to be a bird, too big and silent to be a plane. I stared at the empty sky, my heart starting to pound. My logical mind was racing, trying to find an explanation. A detached retina? A floater in my eye? Stress and lack of sleep causing hallucinations? It had to be something wrong with me, not something wrong with the world. I forced myself to get back to work, determined to find the fault, fix it, and get off this mountain. I worked until well after the sun went down, running on pure stubbornness. Around 10 o'clock, one of the motion-activated floodlights on the corner of the hut snapped on, bathing the area in harsh white light. I jumped, startled by the sudden glare. I went to the small, thick-paned window in the door to see what had triggered it. A deer, probably, but there was nothing there. Just the empty gravel yard and the looming base of the tower. After a minute, the light clicked off, plunging the world back into darkness. And in that instant of returning blackness, I saw them. 2 glowing red circles, floating in the dark. They were about level with the top of the tower, 300 feet up, and they were perfectly still. They weren't blinking like aircraft lights. They just stared, 2 embers burning in the void. I couldn't breathe. I stared at them, unable to process what I was seeing. There was nothing up there for lights to be attached to. Nothing. As I watched, they didn't fly away. They just went out, as if a switch had been flipped. That was it. That was the point where my logical, orderly world shattered. This was not a technical problem. This was not a hallucination. I was in danger. I threw my tools into their bags with shaking hands. The job didn't matter. My boss didn't matter. All that mattered was getting in my truck and driving down that mountain as fast as I could. I grabbed my keys, unbolted the heavy steel door, and stepped outside into the cold night air. And then the sound hit me. It was a piercing, high-frequency screech, a blast of pure electronic noise that seemed to scream from every inch of the tower at once. It was a physical assault, a sound so intense it made the fillings in my teeth ache and my vision swim. I clamped my hands over my ears, stumbling back against the wall of the hut. I looked up at the tower, and my blood ran cold. The immense steel lattice was a black silhouette against the starry sky, and clinging to it, or wrapped around it, or maybe a part of it, was a shape. It was a thing of impossible size, a chaotic mass of angles and darkness that didn't seem to have a coherent form. It was a piece of the night sky that had been torn loose and was moving. And in the center of that living darkness were the 2 red lights, staring down at me. My headlamp flickered once, twice, and died. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, but it was dead too. I looked at my truck. The dashboard lights were dark. Everything was dead. The screech from the tower intensified, and a deep, powerful vibration started to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I was alone, on a barren mountaintop, plunged into darkness with that impossible thing looming over me, and it knew I was there. I did the only thing I could think of. I scrambled back inside the concrete hut and threw the heavy bolts on the door. I huddled in the corner, as far from the walls as I could get, and I waited. I stayed there all night, listening to the screaming of the tower and the deep earth-shaking thrumming, praying for the sun to rise. Just before dawn, the sounds finally stopped. I waited another hour, until the sky was fully light, before I dared to open the door. The world outside was calm and silent. The air was clean. The tower stood there, just a structure of steel and wire, looking perfectly normal. I walked to my truck on trembling legs. I put the key in the ignition. It started on the first try. I drove down that mountain without looking back. I got to the bottom, called my boss, told him I was sick, and that I quit. I never went back. I don't know what I saw up there. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't a machine. It was something else. Sometimes, late at night when it's quiet, I can still hear that faint, chittering static in the silence. It's a reminder that the world is full of strange signals, and some of them you don't want to hear. My grandfather passed away when I was 35, but it took me another 20 years to finally deal with the property he left me. It wasn't much, just a small, hand-built cabin on about 40 acres of steep, wooded hillside, but it was paid for, and that was more than a lot of folks had. For 2 decades, I just paid the piddling property taxes and let the place sit, visited only by hunters who never asked permission and the occasional black bear. But I was getting older myself, starting to think about retirement, and the idea of fixing up the old place started to take root. I remembered it fondly from my childhood, spending a few weeks there every summer. It was a place of lightning bugs and the smell of wood smoke and my grandfather's endless, rambling stories. So, I decided to spend a month up there, by myself, to see what was salvageable and what was rotted beyond repair. The plan was simple: clean it out, patch the roof, and make it livable again. The first week was hard work, but it was satisfying. The cabin was a time capsule, filled with my grandfather's things. Old tools, dog-eared paperbacks, a collection of chipped coffee mugs. He had worked in the coal mines his whole life, from the time he was a boy until the day the company pulled out and shut the whole operation down in the late 60s. The land the cabin sat on was what they called mineral rights property. He owned the surface, but the company owned everything underneath it, and they had burrowed it out like termites. The whole mountain was a honeycomb of abandoned tunnels. Out at the edge of his property, about 100 yards behind the cabin, was one of the old air shafts. It was just a concrete collar sticking a few feet out of the ground, with a heavy, grated steel cap sealed over the top. As a kid, I was terrified of it, convinced that monsters lived down in the dark. My grandfather used to tell me it was just a breathing hole for the mountain, which didn't make me feel any better. It was during the second week that I heard the sound for the first time. I was outside, clearing brush away from the foundation of the cabin, when I heard a faint tapping. It was a strange, hollow sound, and it took me a minute to place it. It sounded like it was coming from underground. I stopped what I was doing and listened. Tap, 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 tap. It was rhythmic, almost like a code. I walked around the cabin, trying to find the source. As I got closer to the back of the property, the sound grew slightly louder, more distinct. I found myself standing right next to the old air shaft, and I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that the sound was coming from deep inside it. I knelt down and put my ear close to the cold concrete, but the tapping had stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was only silence. I told myself it had to be water dripping somewhere deep in the earth, echoing in a funny way. It was an old mine. Things were bound to settle and shift and make noise. I tried to push it from my mind, but the deliberate, patterned nature of the sound was hard to shake. A few days later, I was inside the cabin, sorting through a trunk of my grandfather's old papers, when I found his work journals. They weren't diaries, more like logs. He noted his hours, his pay, cave-ins, equipment failures, and the names of men who got hurt or killed. Tucked into the pages were clippings from old newspapers about mining accidents. Reading them was a sobering history lesson in how cheap a man's life used to be. In one of the later journals, from the last few years before the mine closed, he'd written a few entries that were different. He wrote about hearing noises in a section of the mine that had been sealed off for years. He called them knockers. He wrote that the old-timers believed they were the spirits of dead miners, tapping on the coal seams to warn of a collapse. Sometimes they were helpful, sometimes they were malicious, luring men into unsafe tunnels. He wrote, "Heard the knockers again today in West 4. The whole crew heard them. Sounded like a man with a hammer, clear as day. Foreman told us to get out. Good thing too, the roof came down not an hour later." I closed the journal, the leather cool against my hands. The story sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, and it was coming from directly beneath the cabin. I was lying in my cot, trying to sleep, when it began. Tap, 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 tap. The same pattern as before. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated up through the floorboards. I lay there, frozen, listening to it. It went on for nearly an hour, a steady, methodical knocking from the hollow earth beneath my bed. Every rational explanation fled my mind. This wasn't water, this wasn't the house settling. It was intelligent, it was deliberate. It felt like a signal, a message I couldn't understand, tapped out from a tomb deep underground. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair with a lamp on, listening to the silence, which was somehow worse than the noise. The next morning, I found a long, hairline crack in the heavy stone chimney that ran up the side of the cabin. It hadn't been there the day before. The days that followed were a slow descent into a quiet, gnawing dread. The knocking became a regular occurrence, happening at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes it was faint and distant. Other times it was so close and loud I felt like the floor was going to splinter. I started to feel like I was living on the thin skin of a drum, and something was beating on it from the inside. I stopped working on the cabin. My days were spent walking the property, looking for any sign of change, any new crack in the earth. The area around the air shaft became my focus. The ground there seemed softer, the grass a little more sunken than I remembered. I started talking to myself, trying to reason it all out. It's just subsidence. The old timbers are rotting. The tunnels are slowly collapsing. That's all at Island. But the knocking didn't sound like collapsing rock. It sounded like a fist on a wooden door. It sounded like a desperate plea for help. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the terrifyingly plausible geological explanation and the deeply unsettling, superstitious one my grandfather had written about. The end of my stay came on a Tuesday night. A massive thunderstorm rolled in just after dusk, one of those violent mountain storms that feels like the end of the world. The rain came down in solid sheets, and the wind howled around the little cabin. And as the storm raged outside, the knocking began again, but it was different this time. It wasn't a methodical tapping anymore. It was a frantic, chaotic hammering. It came from all directions beneath me, a panicked, furious drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. It sounded like 100 fists beating against the rock, trying to break through. I stood in the middle of the small room, my heart hammering in my chest as the cabin groaned around me. A loud crack echoed through the room, and I saw the fissure in the chimney widen, dust raining down onto the hearth. The floor vibrated with the intensity of the assault from below. In that moment, I was certain the ground was going to open up and swallow me. I was going to die there, pulled down into the black, forgotten tunnels where my grandfather had spent his life. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and ran out into the storm. The wind and rain were so strong I could barely stand, but I didn't care. I scrambled through the mud and darkness to my truck, which was parked a couple 100 feet away on the dirt track that served as a road. I got in, cranked the engine, and just sat there all night, watching the cabin through the rain-streaked windshield, listening to the thunder and waiting for the ground to collapse. The sun rose on a world that was washed clean and eerily quiet. The storm was gone, and the knocking had stopped. I waited another hour before I got the courage to get out of my truck and walk back to the cabin. It was still standing. The crack in the chimney was wider, a jagged black line from floor to ceiling, but the house hadn't fallen. I walked around to the back of the property, to the air shaft. The change was undeniable. The ground around the concrete collar had sunk by at least 2 feet, forming a shallow, bowl-shaped depression in the earth. The steel grate over the top was now covered in a thin layer of muddy water. I stood there, looking at the sunken ground, and I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't know if I had heard the death throes of a collapsing mine, or the work of my grandfather's knockers, or just the product of my own terrified imagination working overtime. And I knew I didn't want to find out. I went back to the cabin, packed a single bag with my grandfather's journals and a few old photographs, and left. I didn't look back. I sold the land a few months later to a logging company. I told them the cabin wasn't sound, but I didn't tell them why. My project was to document the old logging roads that crisscross the mountains, the ones that have been slowly erased by time and nature. I'm a photographer, and I was trying to capture that sense of decay, of man's efforts being swallowed back up by the wilderness. It meant a lot of time on my own on roads that were barely passable, deep in areas with no cell service. I was prepared for that. I had extra tires, tools, food, water, the works. What I wasn't prepared for was the road that wasn't on any of my maps, old or new. It branched off a state route I knew well, a thin dirt track that looked more like a dry creek bed than a road. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned down it, figuring I'd go a mile or two and turn back. The road just kept going, winding deeper and deeper into a narrow, shadowed valley I'd never seen before. After about 5 miles, the road disappeared into the wide, shallow bed of a river. I tried to ford it, but my truck's engine sputtered, choked, and died right in the middle of the stream, and that was that. I sat there for a while, a special kind of idiot, stuck in a river, on a road that didn't exist, with a dead truck. After an hour of failing to get it started, I accepted my fate. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking, following the river downstream. I figured it had to lead somewhere eventually. I walked for hours. The sun was starting to get low, and a cold knot of real fear was starting to form in my gut. Just as I was starting to think about finding a place to spend a miserable night, I smelled wood smoke. I rounded a bend in the river and saw it. It was a village, a small collection of a dozen or so dark, unpainted timber houses and a larger central building, all clustered on the riverbank. There were no power lines, no satellite dishes. Smoke curled from stone chimneys. It looked like a historical reenactment, a town that had been forgotten by the 20th century, let alone the 21st. A man was standing by the river's edge, holding a fishing pole. He saw me, and his face broke into a wide, placid smile. He was older, with a long gray beard and dressed in simple canvas trousers and a homespun shirt. "Well now, look at that. We don't get many visitors. You lost, son?" I explained my situation, about the truck, the road. He just nodded slowly, his smile never wavering. "Water gets in the works. Happens. Don't you worry. Come on into town. We'll get you some supper and a warm bed. Elias is our smith. He can look at your vehicle in the morning." The relief I felt was immense and overwhelming. His name was Silas, and he led me into the village. People emerged from the houses to watch me pass, and they all had the same serene, unnerving smile. They were polite, welcoming, offering me food and drink. It was all a bit much. Their hospitality was so intense it felt aggressive. They gave me a room in the back of the large central building, which seemed to be a combination of a dining hall and a meeting place. The room was simple, just a bed and a wash basin, but it was clean and warm. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear them singing in the main hall, strange, chant-like melodies that I didn't recognize. The next morning, I met Elias the Smith. He was a mountain of a man with huge, calloused hands. He promised he'd walk upriver and take a look at my truck, but he wasn't in any hurry. "These things take time," he said, his smile as fixed as everyone else's. "You just enjoy our hospitality." I spent the day wandering around the village, trying to be inconspicuous with my camera. The place was even stranger in the daylight. All over the buildings, on door frames and fence posts, were the same carved symbol, a stylized, snarling cat's head with 4 eyes. Inside the main hall, a huge, crude painting of the creature dominated one wall. It was a monstrous thing, a huge, black feline predator with a writhing, snake-like tail and those same 4 glowing eyes. When I asked Silas about it, his smile tightened. "That is the guardian of this valley," he said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "The Spearfinger. She keeps the world at bay, and she keeps us safe. We honor her, and she allows us to live here in peace." He used a different name for it, but it was clear this was their version of a wampus cat, or some other legendary predator. It was the center of their whole world. By the 3rd day, my unease had grown into a palpable fear. Elias still hadn't fixed my truck. He claimed he needed a part that had to be forged by hand. I decided I'd had enough. I told Silas I was grateful for their help, but that I was going to walk back to the main road. His smile finally disappeared. "That would be unwise," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The woods are not safe for outsiders. The Spearfinger is protective of her territory. She can be hungry. It is better for you to wait here. You are safe here." The word "safe" sounded like a threat. I looked around the village. The placid smiles of the villagers now seemed like masks, hiding something cold and possessive. I noticed that wherever I went, someone was always nearby, watching me from a doorway or from the edge of the woods. I was not a guest. I was a novelty, a prize. I was a prisoner. That evening, they told me that my arrival was a great blessing. It had coincided with their annual feast, a celebration to honor the Spearfinger and ensure a bountiful year. The whole village was in a flurry of activity. They were building a massive bonfire in the central square, and the chanting I'd heard the first night was now a constant, droning hum that echoed through the valley. They brought out a huge wooden effigy of the 4-eyed cat, decorated with corn husks and feathers, and placed it next to the unlit pyre. And next to that, they rolled out a large cage woven from thick river cane. It was empty. A woman came up to me with a bowl of stew. "You must eat," she said, her eyes wide with a feverish light. "You must be strong for the celebration. It is a great honor. The Spearfinger will be pleased with such a fine gift." I looked from her ecstatic face to the empty cage, and the cold knot of fear in my stomach became a block of ice. I was the gift. I was the offering. I knew I had to run. I feigned illness from the stew and went back to my room, trying to form a plan. There was no plan. The only way out was the way I came, and the whole village was between me and the river. The drumming started just after dark, a deep, rhythmic pounding that felt like a giant heartbeat. I looked out the single small window in my room. The bonfire was a roaring pillar of flame, casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the square. The villagers were all there, their faces painted with the symbol of the cat, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the drums. They were working themselves into a frenzy. I saw Silas and Elias and 4 other large men detach from the crowd and start walking towards the hall. They were coming for me. I didn't wait. I kicked out the small window frame, scrambled through the opening, and dropped to the soft earth behind the building. I ran. I kept to the shadows, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. A cry went up from the square. They knew I was gone. The hunt was on. The drumming stopped, replaced by the sound of shouts and whistles. I could hear them spreading out, crashing through the woods around the village. I ran blindly, away from the firelight, my only goal to put as much distance as possible between me and them. I burst through a line of trees and found myself back at the river's edge. I plunged into the cold water and half ran, half swam downstream, the sounds of the hunt echoing behind me. I ran all night, a frantic, stumbling flight through the darkness, fueled by pure terror. I fell dozens of times, cutting my hands and face on rocks and branches. I just kept moving. Sometime before dawn, the sounds of pursuit faded, but I didn't stop. When the sun finally rose, I found myself standing on the shoulder of a paved highway. It was the state route I had turned off of what felt like a lifetime ago. I flagged down the first logging truck that came by. The driver took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding face and called the sheriff. I told them everything. They looked at me like I was insane, but they sent a deputy with me to find the turnoff. We drove up and down that stretch of road for 2 hours. There was no dirt track. There was no road. There was just a solid, unbroken wall of trees and dense forest. They found my truck, right where I'd left it, in the middle of the river. The engine was flooded, just like I'd said, but the road I had driven in on, the village, the people, they were all gone. I used to spend a lot of time by myself in the woods, not just for a few hours, but for days at a stretch. It was my way of resetting my brain from my job, which involved staring at a computer screen in a windowless room for 50 hours a week. I knew the area I frequented like the back of my hand. I had my favorite spots, my hidden clearings, and the specific creeks I knew ran cold and clear even in the dead of summer. This one trip, back in late autumn about 10 years ago, was supposed to be no different. I planned a 4-day loop, pushing deeper into a section of state forest that was notoriously rugged and saw very little foot traffic. That was the whole point. I wanted to feel like the only person on the planet for a little while. The first 2 days were exactly that. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of orange and yellow, and the silence was only broken by the sound of wind in the trees and my own footsteps. I felt completely at ease, completely in my element. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I had made camp in a small, sheltered hollow next to a stream, a place I'd used once before. I had my fire going, my tent was up, and I was just finishing a dehydrated meal when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the other side of the stream, somewhere up on the densely wooded ridge. At first I thought it was a woodpecker, but it was pitch dark. The sound was too consistent, too deliberate. Tap, 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 a pause, tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the frantic work of a bird, it was methodical. I stood up and listened, trying to pinpoint the source. The forest was utterly black beyond the small bubble of my campfire light. I called out, a simple, "Hello?" thinking maybe it was another camper, though I couldn't imagine why they'd be making that noise. The tapping stopped the instant my voice carried across the hollow. Absolute silence returned, so thick it felt like it was pressing in on me. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, straining my ears, but there was nothing. I eventually chalked it up to some weird woodland acoustics, maybe a branch knocking against a tree in a strange way, and I tried to put it out of my mind, but a seed of unease had been planted. The next morning, I packed up my camp with a little more urgency than usual. The incident with the tapping had left a residue of anxiety that the bright morning sun couldn't quite burn away. My plan for the day was to follow the stream down the valley before climbing a steep ridge that would eventually lead me back towards the trail where I'd parked my truck. As I walked, I kept scanning the trees around me. The feeling of being watched started to creep in, that primal instinct you can't really explain or ignore. A few hours into my hike, I stopped for water and glanced up at the ridge I had just descended from. That's when I saw it. A flash of white, or maybe a very pale gray, moving between the dark trunks of the trees. It was far away, maybe half a mile, but it was moving parallel to my position. It wasn't a deer, the movement was wrong. It was more upright, more fluid in a way that wasn't animalistic. It would appear in a gap in the trees, then vanish, then reappear further down, keeping pace with me. I told myself it was another hiker in a light-colored jacket. It had to be, but they were way off any marked trail, moving through incredibly thick brush with an unnerving speed and silence. I watched for a few more minutes, and the pale shape continued its silent tracking. I couldn't make out any details, just the color and the unnatural movement. My heart started to beat a little faster. I picked up my pack and started walking again, faster this time, not looking back. I spent the next several hours pushing myself hard, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever I had seen. The terrain was tough, a lot of steep inclines and rocky creek beds, and by late afternoon, I was exhausted. I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark, so I had to find a place to make camp for one more night. I chose a spot that felt defensible, a small, flat area with a large rock formation at my back and a clear view of the woods in front of me. I built a much larger fire than usual, needing the light and the psychological comfort it provided. I sat there, eating my last meal, my knife on my lap and my heavy flashlight within easy reach. The sun went down, and the woods plunged into a deep, impenetrable darkness. The normal sounds of the forest, the crickets, the rustling of small animals, were all absent. There was just a dead, heavy quiet, and then I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins run cold. It was the sound of a voice, but not speaking words. It was mimicking a bird call, a barred owl specifically. "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" I had heard that call 1,000 times. But this wasn't an owl. It was pitched wrong, slightly too high, and the cadence was off, like someone was trying to replicate it from memory and getting it slightly wrong. It was coming from the darkness, just beyond my firelight, maybe 50 or 60 yards away. It called out once, then silence. My entire body was rigid. I grabbed my flashlight, a powerful beam, and shone it in the direction of the sound, sweeping it back and forth. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and bushes, but there was nothing there, just empty woods. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I kept the fire blazing, feeding it every piece of wood I could gather without straying too far from the light. I sat with my back against the rock, just listening. For hours, there was nothing. Then, just before the first hint of dawn started to lighten the eastern sky, I saw him. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the world was in that gray, pre-dawn state where shadows play tricks on your eyes. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a thick poplar tree. He was tall and impossibly thin, so gaunt he looked skeletal. His skin was a pale, pasty gray, and he was covered from head to toe in what looked like dried mud or clay, which explained the pale color I had seen on the ridge. He wore only a pair of tattered, dark pants. His face was a mask of mud, with 2 dark holes where his eyes should be. He was perfectly still, just watching me. I couldn't breathe. It felt like my lungs had seized up. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a cryptid from some local legend. This was a man. And there was something profoundly, terrifyingly wrong with him. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Him watching me frozen in place. Then, he slowly tilted his head to the side, a gesture so unnaturally fluid it looked like his neck was broken. He didn't move any other part of his body, just that slow, deliberate head tilt. That broke the spell. Adrenaline surged through me like an electric shock. I scrambled to my feet, leaving everything behind. My tent, my sleeping bag, my pack with all my gear. I didn't care. I just ran. I crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the branches whipping at my face or the rocks turning under my feet. I didn't look back, but I could hear him. He wasn't running. He was just moving through the woods behind me, making no effort to be quiet. I could hear the snap of twigs, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his footsteps. He wasn't sprinting, he was loping, matching my pace effortlessly. It was a pursuit, not a chase. He was hurting me. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The sun was coming up now, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. Every shadow looked like him. I could feel his presence right behind me, a cold pressure on my back. I finally broke out onto the trail I had been searching for, a thin ribbon of packed earth that felt like a superhighway. I didn't slow down. I followed the trail, knowing it would eventually lead back to the parking lot. The sounds of pursuit faded behind me, but I didn't dare to stop. I ran for another 2 miles, fueled by pure terror, until I finally burst out of the trees and into the gravel lot where my truck was parked. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I peeled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a single, horrifying second, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the forest, right where the trail began, a tall, thin, gray figure, partially obscured by the trees. He wasn't moving, he was just watching me leave. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and told them my story. They were polite, but skeptical. They sent a couple of rangers to my campsite. They found it just as I had left it, my gear untouched. They found no tracks, no signs of another person. They said it was probably a bear, or that I had imagined it, spooked by being alone in the woods for too long. I know what I saw. I never went back to that forest. I don't hike alone anymore. Sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I can still hear that tapping sound in my memory. Tap, tap, tap.